Hi there, I'm Patrick Donegan with HardenStance. Welcome to another Trust Talks with me and the good folks of Enea. We have a terrific lineup of conversations today. We're going to start off with some internal company news and some of the exciting research that's come out of Enea in the telecom security space over the course of the last couple of months and few weeks. We're going to hear about a new AI security report that's been produced in conjunction with cybersecurity insiders. We're going to hear an update from the work that Enea has been doing on learning some infrastructure security lessons from the appalling war in Ukraine. We're going to hear about a new signaling handbook that's being made available. We are going to talk about telecom security regulation from the regulators' perspective. We are going to hear about a new threat detection SDK that Enea is bringing to market. And when we come to talk about the news section, we are going to hear about Spynote, a new Android spyware for banking fraud. So to our first segment, and what's new with Enea in terms of new ideas, new research coming out of the company. I'm joined by Laura Wilber. Laura is Senior Industry Analyst with Enea. Laura, what's new with Enea?
Hello, Patrick. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. We've got 3 pieces of news, 3 new resources coming out that I think that your audience will find very helpful. As you alluded to, first up is the signaling handbook, and this is for regulators and operators. And I think this is just a really important and really helpful guide as regulators try to navigate, understanding signaling, understand how it works, understanding signaling security, and how they can work together with operators to reinforce resilience and security and understanding how that intersects with critical national infrastructure. So Rowland's going to say a little bit more about that a little later. Next up, we have an AI survey. This is a collaborative project with cybersecurity insiders and their huge base of cybersecurity professionals, 600,000 CISOs and frontline security workers. And we ran this over the summer to really try to get our fingers on the pulse of what's happening on the ground. What are attitudes, fears, where are people at in their maturity level, to cut through the hype and find out what's going on. And then on top of that, we produced a report, and then we have a webinar. And for our webinar, I think it's really unique in we convened a panelist of AI scientists at some of the leading companies, Zscaler, Arista Networks, their NDR group, and at our own, Larrabee, our expert in machine learning here, to understand or to discuss these results. And I think this combination of having this on-the-ground research together with AI scientists instead of like product marketing and salespeople discussing the results has produced some very, very interesting insights. For example, there is a tremendous amount of fear out there on the part of cybersecurity professionals.
Good.
Significant, surprisingly so. I was surprised. In fact, 77% are very to extremely concerned about rogue AI.
Yep.
They are very concerned that defensive AI cannot keep pace with offensive, to the point where a quarter thinks probably right now today there's a good chance that there's an offensive cyber AI tool or application out there that is something that is beyond the capabilities of any cyber defenses to stop. I mean, these are significant concerns. Now, you pair that together with the panel of AI experts, and I was a little bit expecting them to say, oh, okay, it's not so bad. But their response was, yep, that sounds right. That's legit. Their fear is real. Should be. And then from there, we work through, once you understand that sort of ground truth, understanding how you can respond to it, what you can do, how they think it's going to play out, and everything that organizations can do to help build security and resilience in the face of new AI innovation on the offensive side. So you really don't want to miss that discussion. And then last up, we have a new report the latest in the research from Carl McDade on the role of mobile technology in the war in Ukraine. And in this installment, I believe this is the 5th in the series, research that projects that he's done, it's looking at tracking of mobile devices during wartime, the methodologies, the implications, and then some recommendations, not only when you're looking at this phenomena in a conflict zone, but far beyond in terms of mobile phone tracking. So another piece of important research, and you won't want to miss that as well.
So to our second segment, where we talk about a couple of key topics in greater detail. And I am joined by Rowland Corr, who is VP of Government Relations for Enea. Hi, Rowland, how are you doing?
Hi, Patrick. Doing well, thanks. It's great to join you again for another Trust Talk.
Likewise. So as our audience will, I'm sure, know, there has been a slew of cybersecurity regulations over the course of the last year or two. There are more to come, affecting how telcos and impacting and setting out requirements for how telcos are required to do cybersecurity. Some of it is specific to the telecom sector, like the UK's Telecommunications Security Act. Some of it is generic, like the NIS2 directive, applicable to multiple critical sectors of industry, of which telco is just one. But what we're seeing is a great many more expectations being placed on telcos in terms of how they do cybersecurity, in terms of being accountable for how they do cybersecurity, in terms of explaining and in some cases justifying how they do cybersecurity to the regulator. It seems that society has decided that the model, the distributed model, whereby organizations and consumers are free or required, left to themselves to protect themselves against cybersecurity threats, that model is changing and becoming somewhat more centralized. Government is deciding that the burden of protection for cybersecurity needs to be assumed more by those larger actors in the digital ecosystem that are capable of absorbing that responsibility. And where you guys sit is an important place, because you're able to support that security improvement of security posture on the part of those telcos, and also to coach regulators in terms of how to get those frameworks implemented. So what are your thoughts on what that landscape's looking like right now, Rowland?
I think you're absolutely right, Patrick. And what's driving, and part of what's driving these worldwide efforts is that recognition, I think, greater awareness of the powerlessness of the victims. And then by that same token, then the actual primary responsibility where that resides with the providers of communication services and networks. And it's very much a global phenomenon, as you've just described. Many countries in the process of updating their legislative frameworks, others having just recently updated theirs, like the UK being a great example, which you mentioned. And these efforts are tied very much to the development and updating of national cybersecurity strategies worldwide as well. And I think much of this stems from a recognition of how fast and how far the threat landscape has evolved since the last such updating in ways that have exposed limitations of existing frameworks. And this manifests not just as gaps, areas that as it hadn't been thought of or weren't covered, but also actually in terms of failings, frankly, where the purpose of existing frameworks hadn't been fulfilled. And we see this, this isn't even implicitly acknowledged, it's quite explicitly acknowledged in many efforts globally. So in the new cybersecurity strategy launched by the US earlier this year, it is framed with reference to how the market alone has not driven the adoption of best practices, for example. So hence the state then seizing its role and imperative and obligation to be the catalyst to achieve their actual objectives, including the objectives of previous frameworks, as well as overhauling. And this idea of overhauling the regulatory environment by way of overhauling the actual protections for people and the services that countries rely on today is common to all of these efforts. In Australia, for example, there is, and this is in the discussion of their strategy 2023 to 2030, there's acknowledgement that cybersecurity has to be taken from a niche technical area supported by a patchwork of policies and approaches to a coherent national strategic cybersecurity capability. And then you mentioned NIS2, that's another important one. Of course, I think there's acknowledgement in NIS2 that NIS1, for example, and other forebear and antecedent frameworks actually weren't prescriptive enough. even as they sought to strike that balance, and I think we'll talk about that today, the challenge of striking balance, that there was that lacking sufficient guidance for the regulated entities, there ended up being an awful lot of disparity within sectors, across countries and between countries. And hence we see emphasis now on harmonization across frameworks, national frameworks, and in the NIS2 directive. And even the idea of minimum harmonization, because some of the changes and trends and the new areas of kind of awareness that are reflected in these efforts is awareness of the external dimension. The fact that, of course, you're regulating for your domestic environment, but part of that is being very, very cognizant of a collective resilience and being harmonized even with those around you, which is true for the EU and also reflected in the US strategies and other strategies. So we're seeing an evolution of approach, an expansion of focus, but also like a change of focus or a refocusing in many ways. Or even a redirection in some notable respects. When it comes to innovation and public policy, this prominent scholar, Mariana Mazzucato, has stressed for years that states need to recognize that innovation doesn't just have a pace or a speed of change, but a direction, and that it's up to states to recognize that and that it can be shaped. And so we see in the development of national cybersecurity frameworks, some states recognizing that and seeking to promote and shape norms in cyberspace, for example, but also to encourage and to ensure that the right capabilities are in place. Now, that does vary quite a lot from framework to framework, and that's partly why we at Enea have produced a guidebook for regulators and for operators in respect of signaling security, because there are pitfalls that have to be avoided at the very outset if the measures and the outcomes of these current efforts are actually to be successful ultimately.
Let's follow up on a few, certainly in terms of the global phenomenon. I totally agree with that. I think there's a tendency in some parts to think that this regulatory wave is focused on developed countries, highly developed markets, and actually, yes, those countries are in the lead. But I see strong regulatory initiatives on the telecom sector in countries as far apart as Tunisia, Thailand, India. Interestingly, I mean, you mentioned Australia, which is very important. It's not without significance that one of the big drivers of Australia's leadership now in terms of trying to develop a national cybersecurity strategy comes from a major hack of one of their telcos, Optus, and that's a large part of the reason why Australia is so out in front. Let me just come to a couple of things though. You talked about harmonization, and harmonization is immensely challenging.
Yeah.
Most telcos aren't where they need to be at a national level yet. Let alone aligning with what their peers are doing in other countries. How do you suppose that harmonization needs to come about?
That is a great question, and I think it comes down to the regulators and/or whichever competent authorities are tasked with designing the new requirements and measures, making them specific enough to actually to enable harmonization to take place, which means being suitably and appropriately comprehensive and detailed and prescriptive, actually. So you see, you mentioned earlier the UK's telecom security requirements are remarkably and very effectively and importantly detailed when it comes to measures, because it's based on knowledge of what resilience looks like. So it is that burden, that immense challenge, I think has to actually be carried by and addressed by the regulators. And in many cases, like Australia being an example we just discussed, it's a community of stakeholders that are developing and are involved in the design of the new frameworks. It is up to, that's where that will be won or lost, that battle actually, to achieve harmonization. Plus, it's also important that it enables a common scope and autonomy for what many frameworks are seeking now, which is a preventative approach and a proactive approach, and even to enable and encourage voluntary incident notification, for example. And all of this, of course, at the same time, trying to strike that balance, that crucial balance for regulators, which pre-existed current efforts, of course, but becomes all the more critical now because there's that expectation, and you spoke to it earlier, Patrick, about there's a high expectation and it's placed on regulators that one, the new regimes and frameworks will be more robust than before, and two, the powers involved will be robustly exercised. I think that is that places really the weight of demand on the regulators and the competent authorities in this case.
And in your view, if I go to, I think the UK is self-evidently a leading market, one or two others as well. But if we go to, most national regulatory authorities and sort of look under the hood at the competence of regulatory authorities, and I don't use that in a disparaging sense. I mean competence in a neutral sense. Do national regulators have sufficient expertise to your point to even know what resilience looks like from a telecom sector perspective? Do they even know what questions to ask in order to arrive at the appropriate framework to get them where they need to be? Does that competence exist in significant enough volume in enough of these regulators, do you think?
Yeah, that's another important question, and the answer is that it varies. But the reason why it varies is important to understand, and even for regulators to understand. I mentioned, and I think we're of course all aware of this expansion of focus and expansion, of the scope of frameworks, which isn't just more of the same. It's about adequately capturing the threat in ways that it wouldn't have been captured before. That doesn't mean, and that doesn't demand simply a continuation for regulators that say on their existing learning curve. What they're finding now is we actually are on multiple different learning curves, and we're at different points on them. And because we're not just talking about new or niche or novel areas of existing threats under broad categories, like ransomware, espionage, fraud. We're talking potentially about the addition for the first time into a requirement for competence on the part of the regulator for systemically important areas of cybersecurity, which have been historically underserved. And mobile signaling security is a very important example in there. And it is one that is reflected, the recognition of its strategic importance is well reflected in the UK framework, the new legislation, and everything that has come out of that, and the implementation there. And so it's that question of competence, I think, is key, because historically it generally hasn't been there when it comes to mobile signaling security. So when it comes to NIS2 and the emphasis in the directive on knowledge sharing and tying of knowledge sharing as a way to increase capability, well, where does the knowledge come from? This requires knowledge creation. And in signaling security, perhaps more than any other area of cybersecurity, that knowledge creation, that threat detection, that ability to actually discover and learn about attacks comes after the protections. The protection is the source of the intelligence. So I think the question of capabilities is key. And first task and challenge is that it's recognized as a fundamental question that can't be taken for granted on the part of regulators.
Yeah. No, and I mean there is a horrible irony. If you take an extremely elderly protocol like SS7, just as it's reaching, it's well past its point of peak maturity in terms of the ecosystem of folks that understand it, know how to run it, know how to operate it, know how to spot for threats for it. Just at that point where it's kind of on the long tail of quietly dying out over many years, just at that point there's a great surge in the requirement for people to understand the damn thing. So clearly your signaling handbook is one tool that's been put out there to help regulators get on top of this. But you're going to need folks who can read the handbook, who can understand the handbook, and can know how to apply it in the context of their telco environment. And again, that's not a given either, is it?
No, that's absolutely true, because, and to your point on where has this competency in signaling historically resided, well, it would have been in teams responsible for managing roaming, for example, not experts whose primary focus and role is defined by is about security and cybersecurity. That is changing, of course, and it is interesting that it's changing at this time. But we see more and more security operations centers and certs and national CSerts integrating and incorporating signaling competence, that is the experts and the technologies, into their teams and their overall suite of actually tools and technologies that they use based on that recognition. So it's recognized, of course, and it's been highlighted by Laura in terms of our own ongoing research in the war in Ukraine. But we also see recognition off the battlefield of the significance. So the Danish Center for Cybersecurity, for example, in their most recent assessment and analysis of threats to the Telecom Center, highlights signaling, and SS7 is named as a state-level threat and an espionage-related threat, for example. Not just SS7, also diameter. And I think the continued persistent ubiquity of SS7 in particular, Patrick, and then, of course, the fact that interconnectivity, which is what this is about, is only going to increase in terms of offering an exploitable attack surface for our attackers, means that that signaling is actually increasing in importance, even with, as you say, their legacy status for ones certainly like SS7.
Let's move on now to talk about the enforcement side from a regulator perspective, because one of the things I hear consistently, and I think is absolutely right, that the enforcement environment is as much about dialogue and relationship as it is about deadlines and punishments, right? In my view, where you have incident reporting deadlines, for example, like the NIS2 directive specifies 24, 72 hours reports, and then the 30-day must be a final report. In my mind, if you have a good relationship with the telco as a regulator, when you produce your final report at 30 days, if it says, at 30 days, we know X, we know Y, we know Z, we've done this, we've done that, there are still a few things we don't know, and they are A, B, C, and we will get back to you on that as soon as possible, or in 6 or 8 weeks, whatever. Okay, you strictly speaking, you violated the 30-day rule, but my goodness, you produced a great report. A smart regulator isn't going to hammer a telco for failing to meet their obligations in that way, right? So on the one hand, there's a case for relationship and understanding, but on the other hand, if you take that too far, you end up with a situation where there's no accountability and the telco can do whatever it wants. So in terms of getting that enforcement balance right, how do what's your counsel to regulators in terms of how to manage that trade-off?
I think the advantage, I suppose, for regulators is that they're, it seems, going by NIS2, for example, that they already anticipate the challenge in administrative terms, even for themselves, when it comes to responding to incident notifications. And so there is there's recognition and scope, as you've highlighted, for flexibility. For example, what I mean specifically, not kind of a free rein of compliance or not, but the incident notification, for example, the actual completion of that task for a regulated entity should not detract resources unduly from their actual incident response effort. So that's where exemptions are carved out to the 24-hour notification or 72-hour notification and others. So I think that, and that, of course, what is happening even around those instances is dialogue, as you said, and greater dialogue is, I think, already occurring. It should be in part of the design process and will be key to actually enabling enforcement to be successful, because it allows for supervision that's shy of enforcement outright. I mean, in terms of issuing binding instructions with a deadline. And I think this collaborative approach to supervision is not only all the more important now, I think it's really going to be leaned into by operators and by regulators, both, which is very, very much help. I think that's going to be key, Patrick, when it comes to the idea of preventative supervision, where you want to be able to identify vulnerabilities. That has to come down to dialogue and being able to determine the appropriateness of measures and mitigations if that is what the actual response or is determined to be by the regulator. So yeah.
I think you make a very good point with respect to, and again, I mean this in a positive way, not a negative way, in terms of some of this new legislation actually talking out of both sides of its mouth in terms of saying, yes, this is what you need to do, and it all sounds terribly draconian. But in 3 or 4 paragraphs down in the same legislation, you'll say something that you'll see to a point that says that basically something that says, fine, this is what you need to be aspiring to, but don't let an obsession with hitting those metrics get in the way of doing what it is you need to do to defend your organization at the time. So they do talk out of the legislation does talk out of its mouth a little bit in two different ways, but I think in an appropriate manner. It's not wrong for it to do that. It's correct for it to do that. And the challenge is to implement that, bring those two considerations to bear on the ground in a constructive way.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the order of the day is robust, but not ruthless.
Right. Oh, I like that. That's excellent. Robust, but not ruthless. I like that. That's awesome. Well, that's a terrific way to end this this segment, Rowland. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks, Patrick.
All right, so to our second segment, and I'm joined once again by Laura. And Laura is very happy because she has recently launched Enea's new Threat Detection SDK into vendors and telcos and XDR and NDR vendors potentially. Very interesting development. Laura, tell us about the new products.
Yeah, thank you. I am really excited about this, our latest innovation. And as a matter of fact, I just recently did a discussion on it and went on for nearly 40 minutes talking about it. So I'm gonna keep it short here, but it's very exciting. I'll give you the highlights. And in fact, on the way in here, I made myself a little mnemonic device so I could stay on task, not get carried away with the assignment. So my mnemonic device is going to be VIP. This stands for the key reasons why this thing exists, what we're trying to solve, and what we think it's going to provide a beautiful solution for. So first of all, the Enea Cosmos Threat Detection SDK, mouthful of a product, is a intrusion detection system in the form of an SDK, and that doesn't exist anywhere on the market right now. So what we've done is we've taken the core functionalities of the most trusted, most widely used IDS out there, Suricata, which is developed by the Open Information Security Foundation, and Enea Cosmos IX Engine, which is the most trusted, widely deployed deep packet inspection tool on the market. And we put these two together and then put it in the form of an SDK. And what we were hoping to do with this, one is at a big picture level, right now with the way our networks have evolved, you know, we've got people working from everywhere, any device, any user, it's everything is based on the cloud. And network intrusion detection, which has been around for a long time, Suricata was first launched 2009, 2010, has become more important now because you're losing all your borders. You're losing all those hard perimeters that we had. And so the two things that you'll hear talked about a lot are zero trust, where you're trying to just connect individual well-vetted users to a specific resource, get in and get out and not be able to move around laterally and connect to anything else. And then to go with that, that's sort of the, zero trust. You're not going to trust everybody. Do you remember the old saying, trust but verify? Zero trust is kind of never trust and always verify, never stop verifying. So that's where the intrusion detection come in. On the network, it goes passively. You can see exactly what's happening on the wire, and you can say, yes, I trust you. Okay, you're going to get this resource, but we're going to be here watching to see what's really going on, and you detect any sort of intrusion coming in there. So it's a really pivotal technology. Now, the challenge with Suricata, which is a fabulous software solution. Again, it's the bedrock of the industry, both for commercial development as well as people just deploying it as is it wasn't natively made for the environment we have today, for the extreme performance and scaling requirements of the cloud, and for these crazy hybrid networks with IoT and OT and SaaS applications, et cetera. So this is the big challenge that we're coming at. So back to VIP. The first one is visibility, as I was just mentioning, seeing what's happening on these crazy networks. Now, Suricata is not a DPI tool. It's an intrusion detection system, a complete application. So it can see maybe a couple of dozen protocols, and it can round up some good metadata, some good information you can use for network security monitoring. But Enea Cosmos IX Engine can see 4,300 verified protocols. It produces 5,900 types of metadata, It can see encrypted traffic. It can describe both a category and increasingly now with machine learning at the application level, encrypted traffic without decryption. It can spot evasive traffic. It can detect if there's, for instance, any kind of spoofing going on of applications and files, etc. So you've got this enormous, visibility. This is the bedrock view of everything that's really flowing around out there. And in addition, we have, of course, the protocols that they're constantly in development, 24/7, both being updated and new ones coming along that can take every breaking new hot, social app or communication tool or, a software office package, et cetera, whatever it may be. So we bring this visibility. And why does this matter? Well, there's for one thing, being able to see all of this right now. Suricata is completely blind to encrypted traffic, and today that's most traffic in an enterprise, as well as, of course, what you're dealing with on telecom networks. Traffic is encrypted, and Suricata has scaling problems. So when you can hit a point where you start shunting traffic through without looking at it. So you've got a lot of traffic that's not inspected. So one thing we can do is bring all that visibility back and help people reach, if they want, 100%, visibility on the traffic that flows through. And the other thing that's really important is that kind of broad observability or visibility is really needed both for machine learning, advanced analytics, and most people that want to build an advanced IDS now, you need a lot of really good quality data to build that and refine, to build models and develop them, and then to train and refine them. And the other thing is custom rules. Because when Suricata works on rules, right? It does both. It does anomaly detection, but also works on signatures for known threats. And there's communities, open source communities that produce tons of rules. There's professional sets, EP Pro and whatnot, that have huge commercial sets of rules for Suricata. But the ones that are the most effective, ultimately, that have very outsized impact, are the ones specifically written for an environment. What's happening on your network, what's normal on your network. And having that visibility allows you to create custom rules that otherwise you wouldn't. A little stat from a rule study was custom rules. There was a study done of like 10 years worth of rules, how they worked, how they were maintained, their effectiveness. And just a little teeny percent, 3% of all rules resulted in nearly a third of all true positives, true attacks happening that needed to be stopped. So that little bit of custom rules was responsible for, nearly a third of the performance of actually stopping threats. So that's really important. That's visibility. Do you have any questions on visibility?
Laura, let me ask you just one question there. So how does the threat intelligence updates work in the Cosmos solution? Is it dependent entirely on Suricata, or is there an opportunity to be able to interweave or to integrate, a customer's own separate private threat intel feeds into that environment?
Yep, both. So
you can do both. You can integrate.
It supports all the same rule sets, all the commercial and open source rule sets, as well as the ability using Suricata syntax to write rules and modify rules for your own
okay, cool.
Yep. So both of those. The next slide was just on the integration. As I mentioned, there's Suricata is a monolithic full application, and if you want to build, when you're building intrusion detection system, that's one piece you've probably heard. It goes together and is built into network detection and response, and then on top of that, you can go into extended detection and response, which puts together network and endpoints. You do very sophisticated systems for threat detection and response. If you're working with monolithic app and you're a solution developer, either commercial or in a large org, it's harder to do if you're trying to navigate a monolithic app. And then at the same time, if you're there's some you can get Suricata and some open source DPI in the form of complete NDR solutions or complete sensors. But again, all of this is kind of closed. So what we wanted to do was let's let's give you the core that you really need, and then let you go forth and build what you want. Easy, fast integration and development. And the other thing is just making it easy with the licensing. The people at Open Source or Open Information Security Foundation, shout out to Kelly Masada. You know, they've been really great about working with us on licensing, so we could take care of all of the, you know, licensing is never fun, it's time consuming, etc. We can take care of all of that for customers. So if they're doing multi-site deployments, multiple deployments, you know, they can focus on their software and not all the licensing issues around when you adapt, you know, open source software. And then the last thing is, of course, performance. And for performance, as I mentioned, you know, it just kind of wasn't made for this world. You know, this helps Suricata adapt. You can do a lot to improve, and there's a lot of tuning that people do to improve the performance of Suricata, but still, you know, it's a different environment. And I have to say, you know, you should know in a lot of environments, you can put Suricata out just like it is, and it's going to perform great, right? It's more of the extreme sort of environments, you know, very large organizations or software vendors, security solutions, professional solutions. But there's two things that help in particular with performance. And one is in a lot of the big cloud security solutions now, or not even on cloud, some are like a UTM on premise, but they have a lot of different functions that need the output of DPI. And so you've got the packet processing that you have to do for DPI. Suricata is doing packet processing. You have to have your IDS. So in a lot of these platforms, you're doing double packet processing, and that can be a huge performance hit. So this, if you could just do that once, do a single pass DPI essentially, and then have it feed all those functions, you get an enormous gain there. And then the parsers themselves in iExtended are far more efficient. You know, it was made to do this, you know, than Suricata. So you get more important parsers. I would just one note on that. The thing that you have to decide is right now, as I mentioned with Suricata, there's a lot of traffic that can be not inspected, it's uninspected. So you can, if you want, you know, run this, run the IDS on all encrypted. You can see all your traffic. You can do all your encrypted traffic. You can see much more than you could see before. So one thing you can do is balance. You're still going to get better performance even than if you were just doing sort of apples to apples, clear text and one or the other. But decide what trade-off works for you. You know, do you really need to like decrypt and inspect that Disney movie, you know, that somebody's streaming on their desktop, you know, or can you just know something is safe and bypass? And even with for our product has a first packet classification tool that will let you see very reliably from the first packet what a lot of these applications are and what they're doing and whether they're safe or not safe, so you can manage your traffic. So visibility, integration, performance, and taking an absolutely fabulous tool, Suricata, and marrying it with our own to make something that's special and adapted to some of these new extreme environments that we have.
Last question, if I may, Laura. Any early first customers that you're able to tell us about, or is that still to be
at
kept?
this point, it's confidential,
Okay.
but I hope to be able to do a case study very soon. I hope we'll be able to do that, but right now that's confidential. But I can give you an indication. So one is private 5G.
Oh, okay.
In an industrial setting. So it's an IIoT, private wireless, private 5G wireless. There's another that's a very large organization, and that's kind of new for us as well. You know, our engine is used by software vendors, everybody in networking, enterprise cybersecurity, and the telecom industry as well. But the solution vendors, but we're seeing telecoms that are very interested in this. It's not just in terms of the private 5G, but there's also the larger ones that are offering business service, SD-WAN, because you can't just offer networking anymore. There's no such thing as SD-WAN. There's only secure SD-WAN. There's only secure networking. And they're going to want as a minimum network detection and response.
Yeah.
And so that's new for us. Extremely large organizations that have in-house development teams. So that's kind of new as well, which is all really, really exciting. So more to come.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Laura.
Thank you.
So to the last segment of Trust Talks, where we look at news items, developments out in the bigger world, and share some thoughts on what the implications of those might be. On Trust Talks before, we've spoken about signaling-borne location tracking and spying threats. We've talked about smishing-delivered spyware like Pegasus that's intended for use by law enforcement, but ends up being used for nefarious purposes like undermining spying on political opponents. Researchers at a company called Cleafy, C-L-E-A-F-Y, announced at the end of July that they were seeing a very aggressive campaign called Spynote, a type of Android spyware that's being used to carry out banking fraud. What do you make of this one, Rowland? Why did you think it was worth pulling out?
Actually, what stood out first to me, Patrick, I think was just the SMS still significant and prominent in this kind of story, and not just as one of the infection vectors involved, but also as like the target and one of the objectives of the attackers here being to exfiltrate SMS two-factor authentication security codes from the respective targets. And at the same time, of course, I was struck by that this kind of attack, this interception of SMS security codes, is something we have seen in a significant uptick in at Enea in by our threat intelligence unit. And it's a reminder, of course, that advanced attackers, in this case, the context of the Cleafy reporting, the Spynote reporting, is banking spyware, or banking malware, fraud. But fundamentally, these kinds of attacks are seeking to do the same thing in respect of their targets. It's about being able to bypass protections and to be able to gain illicit access to accounts, but also to extract further exploitable metadata in respect of the targeted devices, on top of the location tracking, the things that we're more kind of intuitively familiar with. In other words, it reminded me of the intersection between spyware and mobile signaling and surveillance threats, and the exploitation of access and unauthorized intrusions by attackers for a range of purposes, including fraud. And this is something we have seen, as I've said, and their analysts are tracking. But the GSMA have also highlighted this, actually, in their most recent Telecom Security Landscape report. In the section treated on spyware, the importance of correctly configured signaling firewalls is really emphasized. And I think actually that the inclusion of that language about correct configuration is really important. That's a way of saying it's not enough to simply have it deployed. The traffic, it needs to be monitored and analyzed. As we were talking earlier about different regulatory approaches, that is emphasized, and that is captured in the UK's legislation, for example, the actual monitoring of traffic. And it also reminded me, and I'll actually close on this point, of analysis done by the UK's NCSC further to the development of the telecom security requirements, where it stated in respect of the signaling plane, recognized as a high-risk area, critical function, and sensitive data to be protected, that the scenario is very much similar to that of malicious IP traffic from an external source and should be treated the same way. So this story actually, seeing SMS actually reminded me of all of those things, and what we need to bear in mind as defenders and those that seek to protect our networks against these kinds of attacks, no matter who the attacker is.
Reasonable assumption, though, that the protection against this particular piece of spyware, presumably the recommendation would be the traditional one, which is, yes, network security implementations in spades, but combined with endpoint as well, I assume.
Yeah, and I think it's not a either or choice. It really has to be, and this is what we're seeing in the more innovative regulatory approaches, idea of both and the inclusion and the wider incorporation of securing attack surfaces and interfaces that are exposed to attack. And again, so it's endpoint protection and also network level protection. And part of the reason for that, it was one of your opening remarks. When it comes to the victims, when it comes to network level attacks, that's where they're most powerless. That's where they have the least recourse, as acknowledged in the US strategy, for example. But it's also been highlighted in the context of Europe by Enea several years ago already, actually, there's very little a user can do, mobile subscriber, to protect themselves against signaling-borne surveillance, irrespective of how advanced their other protections are against wider cyber threats.
Sure. There you go. Very good. Thanks indeed, Rowland.
Thank you, Patrick. Great to join you again.
So that concludes another Trust Talks. Thanks very much indeed to you, the audience, for participating. Many thanks indeed to Rowland and Laura for their contributions. You should shortly, at the conclusion of this event, receive an email from Enea, which will have all 4 of the collaterals referred to during the course of the conversation: the AI report, the signaling handbook, the latest report on learnings from the Ukrainian battlefield, and the Threat Detection SDK, a positive Santa's sled full of content from Enea to get you thinking about where you go in the industry next. That's it from me, Patrick Donegan. Thank you very much indeed for participating, and see you next time.
Thanks so much, Patrick.
Thank you very much.